If you've spent any time on the game development side of YouTube over the last few years, you might have noticed a trend of game developers taking 2D games and recreating them using 3D assets. After watching a few of these, I wanted to try and take a shot at it. However, I'm still a beginner at game development. I only have a limited experience in making 2D games, and no experience making 3D games, so I want to swap the trend around. I want to take a 3D game and remake it with 2D graphics. Now I just had to decide what kind of game I wanted to recreate. I knew I wanted an RPG, and I knew I wanted it to have turn-based combat. I also wanted the game to have some kind of unique looking overworld that I could try and bring to life in 2D. This led to me choosing the third entry in the Persona series as my game. If you don't know anything about Persona 3, there's a giant tower called Tartarus that the main characters explore at night. In there, they fight shadows using the power of Persona. For this project, I wanted to recreate Persona 3's turn-based battle system, and I wanted to recreate the procedurally generated floors of Tartarus. My focus was a little scattered when I created the project. For some reason, one of the very first things I worked on was this battle menu that rotates like a revolver barrel. I have no idea why I decided that the most important thing to work on within the first hour of development was a UI element that was probably going to be replaced later. Nevertheless, I did manage to get this menu mostly working. Back in the overworld, I created an enemy, which is this gray square. He picks a random direction every few seconds and moves. I also gave the enemy this detection range that it can see the player if it gets too close. Now when the player enters this detection area, it will chase after the player until it either catches them or the player manages to create enough distance. A little bit of wiring later, and now if we come into contact with the enemy, we can transition to the battle scene. If the player strikes without being noticed, then they have the advantage, but if the enemy strikes first, then the opposite is true. At this point, I continued to build out my battle scene. I tried to keep everything organized by using finite state machines. If you're new to making games and don't know how state machines work, I highly recommend watching some videos on them, as they've been vital in keeping my code organized in a logical way. Here's what my battle state machine looked like by the end of this project. My general rule was to create a new state anytime that the player's input was going to do something different. I'm now to the point where I have 4 characters and each one gets a turn to attack one of the enemies and do some damage. The enemies are also able to fight back. Now that basic attacks were working, I created a skill menu. It is horrendously ugly, but it does get the job done. For now, I'm just glad that it scrolls properly, because that was actually way harder than I thought it would be. A few more lines of code, and now we can populate the skills menu with the character's current skills. Since the time has come to start implementing player data, I've decided that I'm only going to implement 4 playable party members. Persona 3 has 10 playable characters, and there's no way I'm doing art for that many, so I think just having enough for a full party of 4 should be enough. The 4 characters that I chose for this are the main character, Yukari, Junpei, and Aigis. I wrote out the move definitions for some of each of these characters' basic moves, and now the skill menu loads these moves and they can be used on the enemies. Currently, my attacks all do a set number of damage regardless of things like stats and typing. I had to figure out how to calculate how much damage each attack should actually do. Thankfully, I found an extremely helpful guide in the Steam community called The Math Behind Persona 3 Reload's Combat. This post gave me everything I needed to know in order to replicate the damage calculations used in P3R. I copied these formulas into code, and now attacks and skills are doing the correct amount of damage. The biggest feature that sets the Persona series combat apart from most turn-based RPGs is the one more system. In a nutshell, if you hit an enemy's weakness, they get knocked down and you get another turn to attack. Thankfully, this is actually really simple to implement. Whenever a character strikes a weakness, we just skip out on incrementing the turn counter and that character will move a second time. After working on this game for a few days straight, I'm getting sick of watching the white squares beat up on the gray squares, so I decided to whip up some better placeholder sprites to look at instead. These aren't my final character sprites, but I just wanted to look at something different. Here's what I created for the protagonist, Junpei, Yukari, and Aigis. Let's work on some menus. Persona 3 has a main menu with options for using skills, items, viewing saved personas, equipping gear, looking at your player's status and social links, and the system menu. I'm going to be skipping over the status and social link menus, so that means I have 6 menus to remake, including the main one that you're seeing right now. To remake the menus, I basically just looked at screenshots of the original P3 and copied them as close as I could. Here's what they look like now. The skill, item, and equip menus are fully functional, and you can use skills and items, and you can swap out gear. Coming back to the battle scene for a moment, I realized that I forgot one of the most important parts of the Persona series battle system, the all-out attack. Remember how I said that you could get an extra turn by hitting an enemy's weakness and knocking them down? Well, if you knock down every enemy on the field, you get the opportunity to do an all-out attack. All the living party members rush to the center of the field and do a large amount of damage to all the enemies. I made a new state for my battle state machine and got the damage calculation from that Steam guide I mentioned earlier. And boom, just like that, we've got an all-out attack. Before moving on, I did a little bit more work on the UI. To start, we have these nice looking type icons next to the skills. And I also replaced that revolver circles menu with this much nicer looking one made out of squares. I think this fits the pixel art aesthetic a lot better. We also have some new portraits. In the original P3, each party member is one of these portraits on the right side of the screen. I tried to quickly replicate these, and they turned out like this. Yeah, they're bad, I know. I was gonna fix them, but I just ended up putting it off until later. By this point, the functionality of the battles was mostly complete. I still had some edge cases to iron out later, but all the important stuff is here. So, I figured this was a good time to pivot and start working on the overworld. In Persona 3, Tartarus is a tower full of hundreds of floors, and each floor is randomly generated. As you explore, you can find treasure or shadows to fight, and the way you progress is by finding the stairs that lead to the next floor. I started out by defining my working space as an 8x8 grid. I called each cell in this grid a room. First, I would designate 2 cells to be my starting room and my ending room. Then, I wanted to generate a random path between the two, and this was actually a lot more difficult than I thought it would be. Pathfinding is one of the most commonly discussed problems in programming, and you can find tons of different ways to find the shortest or longest path between 2 cells, but a random path? It was surprisingly difficult. I ended up getting no help from the internet, so I decided to brute force it myself. My algorithm was very simple. We pick random starting and ending rooms, then, starting at our first room, we pick a random neighbor that we haven't gone to before and go there. We just repeat this process over and over until we either find the ending room or we get stuck. If we get stuck, then we go back to the previous room and pick a different neighbor. You might think this would run slow, but it's actually surprisingly fast. I didn't run any exact timestamps, but I could find several hundred paths per second with no issue. Here's a tile set that I made based on the look of the first block of Tartarus. Using this tile set, I've created rooms for every single combination of openings that a 4-way room can have. So we've got 1 room with 4 openings, 4 rooms with 3 openings, 6 rooms with 2 openings, and 4 rooms with only 1 opening, which means that they're dead ends. Now we can traverse this path that we've generated and place rooms along it. But of course, we can't just place any room in any spot. We need to take into account the other parts of the path surrounding it, the borders of the 8x8 working space, and the placement of the starting and ending rooms. For example, if we've already generated these rooms, and now we're trying to decide what to place here, we know that these 2 positions that connect to the path must be open, and this position that leads downward must be closed. So in this case, we only have 2 possible rooms to place. Using this logic, we can place the rest of the rooms along our path. Then comes the final step of the generation. We have a valid path to the ending room, so now we just need to fill in all of these holes that we've created. We can use the same logic as before to randomly place more rooms in these holes. We can repeat until all gaps are closed and we have a fully generated floor of Tartarus. If I made that sound easy, it wasn't. This took several iterations to get right. It didn't help that I basically followed 0 tutorials. Now that we have some floors, I spawned my player character into the starting room, and randomly spawned some shadows into the other rooms. And now, we can properly explore while fighting shadows. The only main feature that our overworld is missing at this point is some treasure chests, so I threw together this very ugly sprite based on the chests in-game. I think the original sprite is supposed to be a briefcase or something. I made it interactable, and so when the player interacts with it, it randomly gives some money, an item, or a piece of equipment. Back to the battle scene, I began to add a bunch of miscellaneous features. I made these effects for super effective and critical attacks. I made this little animation for when somebody gets knocked down. I tried to move the camera around to better indicate whose turn it is, and I also added a bit of screen shake for those super effective and critical hits. Finally, I decided to make some animations for the magic skills. Here's the skill animations for fire, ice, wind, electric, light, dark, and almighty. I'm more proud of some of these than others, but I still think they're sufficient. Right now, the lack of impact on the all-out attack is particularly bothering me, so I threw together this very simple smoke sprite, and then, during the all-out attack, I spawned in like 50 of them and made it spew out in a random direction and then dissipate, and it turned out way better than I was expecting, so I made a few more smoke variations and spat them out at random, and boom, I think that looks pretty good. Back to the equipment menu for some reason. The spiders in my brain desperately wanted me to make it so that all characters could swap out their equipment, even though literally nobody watching or playing this was gonna care. Well, here we go. It works now. Are you happy? Are you happy? Oh yeah, persona switching works now. I originally wasn't gonna add this in because I didn't want to make art for multiple personas, but it was so easy to add that I just did it anyways. I'm still only making art for one persona, but at least now the protagonist can use the skills of multiple personas. You might have also noticed these nice blue menus. I wasn't really sure how to make these menus look nice with pixel art, since the original menus aren't too visually interesting to begin with, so I just made it a solid color rectangle with another solid color rectangle behind it. A little bit of animation, and I actually think this looks good. It looks like something that Persona 3 Reload might have used. Another primary feature that I've skipped out on up to this point is shuffle time. At the end of some battles, shuffle time will pop up. Here you'll see some cards with rewards on them. Then they shuffle themselves around, and if you kept track of the one that you wanted, then you can choose it and get that reward. So, I spent way too long making art for these cards, along with a flipping animation that goes to one of the 5 rewards. Cup heals your party by 50%, Wand increases your XP, Coin gives you some money, Sword gives you a new piece of equipment, and the Persona card gives you a new persona to use. Here's what it looks like in action. I have one more thing to add to the actual logic of the battles, and that's to handle Drain, Repel, and Null affinities. These are pretty self-explanatory. Hitting an opponent with a type that it drains will heal it by a small amount, hitting them with a type that it repels will make it bounce the attack back, and hitting them with a type that it nulls just nullifies the attack entirely. In other news, I downloaded a nice looking font and added it to all of my text. I honestly have no idea why I didn't do this sooner. Finding a decent font took like 10 minutes, and adding it to the entire project took like half an hour. And everything looks so much better. I'm definitely going to invest in a font sooner next time. This was the best effort to results ratio that I got throughout the entire project. By this point, I've got 99% of my game working, so the name of the game is Artwork and Polish. I made this text that says who has the advantage look good, I made the one more text look good, I have this text in the top left of the battle scene that basically narrates the entire battle, I made it look good. I made the all-out attacks look a bit better by adding this effect. I don't really know what to call it, but I've noticed a lot of games do this kind of thing to make it look like something is moving more than it actually is. Alright, it's time to make the world look a bit better. I don't think it looks particularly bad right now, but there's 2 main things that need to be fixed. The first is that these walls look terrible. I don't know why I made them like this, they don't even look like this in the original game. So here's my updated tile set. I fixed the walls, and I also added some stairs to put in the starting and ending rooms. This already improved the look of things quite a bit, but the other problem is that the lighting is way too bright. Persona 3 is a very moody game. Tartarus is very dark, and the moon is green during the dark hour, which makes everything have a green hue. So I remade all of my rooms from earlier from scratch using my new tile set, and I added some green lights to them to try and simulate the light coming through, and here's what it looks like now. And I am super pleased with how this turned out. I think this feels so much more like Tartarus. Alright, it's time to work on something that I've been dreading for this whole project, the character art. You would think that someone who starts a whole project based on remaking a game in a certain style would be skilled at making art in that style, but if you didn't already gather from the look of my tile sets, I am very much a beginner at pixel art. And I have a lot of sprites to make. For all 4 of my characters, I need an idle sprite, a dead sprite, a walking animation, an attack animation, a summon animation, and a sprite for the persona. And then, for the protagonist, I'm going to need idle, walking, and attack animations for all 4 directions instead of just 1. It's been several days of working only with pixel art, and I have been severely humbled. Making all of this art has taken so much longer than I thought it would, and it was a lot harder than I thought too. I was even starting to think I couldn't make this whole video because the pixel art wasn't going to be up to par with other videos of its type. But that was just something that I had to come to terms with. Of course it wasn't going to look good. I'm a beginner. Why was I so distraught that my art looked like an amateur drew it, when it was an amateur that drew it? So, I took these feelings as motivation to get better at pixel art later, and completed my sprites. Here's the protagonist. Here's Yukari. Here's Junpei. And here's Aigis. Then we've got the personas. Here's Orpheus, the protagonist persona. Here's Hermes, Junpei's persona. Here's Io, Yukari's persona. And here's Palladian, Aigis' persona. Just the character art wasn't enough though. Remember those portraits on the side of the screen? Yep, I've got to redo those too. This time I didn't bother to try and do it from scratch. Persona 3 already has some character portraits that appear during all-out attacks. So, I copied those, shrunk them down, and drew over them with some simpler colors. And here's the result. I think the protagonist and Yukari's portraits look really good. Junpei and Aigis' portraits look a little off, but at this point I'm just glad that they look recognizable. One last bit of art is I finally made a sprite for the enemy shadows. Unfortunately they all look the same, even in the overworld, but I just couldn't be bothered to make more sprites at this point. Now that I'm finally done with all the art, it's time to put it into the game. I exported everything and wired up all the animations. I made this particle effect that plays when the characters summon their personas. I added a bunch more camera shake for drama. I messed with the timing of everything to try and maximize impact. I downloaded the game's music and sound effects and learned how to play it properly in Godot. Then I did my last few rounds of bug fixing. And now, we finally have a completed game. Here's the final result.
Here's a way, kind of breathe out, face reality. Never the enemy, you're fighting, come society. Damn right, mommy's not here, gonna fight you. Right here, shadow 10 o'clock direction. Seize the world, destroy the game. Slow motion, give me motivation. Get on the rifle, rounds up around, spit out. Watch out, get this till out, get more this. The bombs won't ground.
So, what did I learn? Well, the biggest thing is I'm now much more proficient in Godot than when I started. I also learned a lesson firsthand that I've heard many game developers mention for years. However long you think a project is going to take, it's actually going to take at least double that. My biggest takeaway, though, is that I need to spend some time improving my art. Not only because I'm not impressed with my current skill, but also because I've realized how important art is to making a good game. I really think my project sprung to life after I started focusing on the visuals, even though all of the functionality was already there at that point. So I think I'll spend some time to improve art soon. I might even make a video on it.